Welcome to Teolumen Insights, where we reveal the hidden forces that shape the way you live and show you how to use them to create real transformation and supercharge your health, mindset, and daily life. Here are your hosts, Emma Greenwood and Nathan Sinclaire.
Teolumen Insights. All right, buckle up, you seasoned seekers of truth, you folks north of 33 who know a thing or two about the weirdness life throws our way. Welcome to a deep dive that's going to challenge your assumptions, maybe tickle your funny bone, and hopefully leave you with some serious food for thought about this enigma, Páter František Ferda.
Teolumen Insights. Indeed. For you, our listeners, who've seen a few things in your time and aren't easily fazed, prepare to have your perspectives stretched. We're diving into the reported extraordinary abilities of this man based on some fascinating, if sometimes head-scratching, accounts of his life and insights.
Head-scratching is putting it mildly. We're talking about a Proust who, the stories go, could diagnose what ailed you from a snapshot across hundreds of miles. Imagine that for a minute. Forget your fancy MRIs. This guy just needed your yearbook photo. Our mission: to wade through these tales, separate the truly wild from the merely weird, and see what resonates, what sparks those aha moments for you without drowning you in the details. So picture this: someone who seemingly understood the spiritual side of a forest as well as the biochemical imbalances in your blood.
Wow.
That's the territory we're mapping today. What does that even tell us about the limits of human perception? Okay, let's unpack this. Páter Ferda's story starts with a bit of a twist. He was a priest, yes, but his priestly duties got, complicated under the old regime.
What's intriguing right off the bat is how his life took this unexpected detour. For 8 long years, he was rolling barrels in a brewery. Talk about a change of pace from spiritual guidance.
Yeah.
It wasn't until much later that he finally got to work in a retirement home for religious sisters, almost 20 years after the initial disruptions.
And it was there, amidst the quiet routine of caring for the elderly, that these other talents, let's call them, started bubbling to the surface. Now, how did our source author even stumble upon Páter Ferda?
Well, turns out it was through a shared fascination with the work of a different Kafka, Kafka. No relation to the writer, Franz Kafka.
Right, not the metamorphosis guy.
No, this Kafka was deep into the power of the subconscious. He wasn't just theorizing. He was running experiments that suggested, under hypnosis, the subconscious could actually interact with the physical world in some pretty mind-blowing ways.
Mind-blowing like?
Well, like large objects moving seemingly on their own, a painting lifting off a wall in front of a whole audience.
A painting floating. That sounds like something out of a magic show, not a scientific experiment. And then there's the bit about a 4-kilogram vase just blinking in and out of existence. It's utterly bonkers.
I know.
What kind of energy, what kind of hidden abilities are we even talking about here?
And apparently Kafka's subjects had their own way of explaining it, something about a radiant energatron, this non-physical fluidic body tied to the soul. It makes you wonder if there are forces at play we haven't even begun to comprehend.
A radiant energatron.
Okay. It certainly pushes the boundaries of conventional understanding. Kafka's work really delved into these less tangible aspects of being human. He even had a theory about levitation, describing it as the cytonic body projecting itself, essentially standing on invisible stilts.
Invisible stilts. You gotta give Kafka points for creativity, if nothing else.
Right. And get this. There's this incredible account of a hypnotized subject who, when pushed to do something against his morals, didn't just refuse. He levitated about 150 steps into the air.
150 steps up.
Up. And when they tried to physically handle him, he exerted this intense gravitational pull that 7 people couldn't overcome. Kafka even documented subjects making 70-meter leaps.
70 meters. That's leaping across a football field. My critical brain is screaming red flags, but the sheer audacity of these claims is, well, it's undeniably fascinating. It makes you question what we think we know about the limits of the human body and mind. But let's reel it back to Páter Ferda. His foray into these extraordinary perceptions apparently started in 1964 with this sudden, vivid knowing about a friend suffering from kidney stones.
Yes, and what stands out is the clarity and the specificity. He instantly knew the patient had kidney stones, the exact number, the precise location, all without any physical contact or medical reports. It was this event that really seemed to set him on his path of using these abilities to help the sick.
So, a spontaneous beginning.
It seems so. A key insight here for you, our listener, might be that sometimes profound abilities can emerge in the most unexpected circumstances.
And his diagnostic methods were just as unconventional. He could gaze into your eyes or just look at a photo or read a short note about you and bam, a 2-minute health assessment.
Yeah.
Then he'd scribble down these incredibly detailed findings, biochemical levels, hematological parameters, the specific site of inflammation, even pinpointing bizarre causes like toxins and clothing dyes. It's like he had an internal medical scanner that could work remotely.
The sheer reach of his diagnoses is staggering up to 1,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
He even described this subjective experience of sending out a green ray to connect with the person.
A green ray. My logical brain wants a peer-reviewed study on that.
I know. But he described it almost like a psychic Wi-Fi signal for health information. He claimed to have made tens of thousands of these remote diagnoses with remarkable accuracy. So what's really impactful here is the idea that perhaps our awareness and our ability to connect with others extend far beyond our physical senses.
But the source claims these detailed diagnoses were confirmed by standard medical tests in a massive number of cases, around 100,000. That's hard data to ignore, even if the method sounds utterly wild.
It is hard to ignore.
And it wasn't just the present. He reportedly had glimpses into the past and the future. That's not just diagnostics, that's bordering on precognition.
Indeed. And Páter Ferda wasn't just willy-nilly with these abilities. He operated under certain principles. He consciously chose to focus his energy, avoiding spreading himself too thin.
Smart, don't dilute the gift.
Exactly. He emphasized the intricate nature of illness, the crucial role of the individual in understanding the root causes, and the necessity of personalized treatment. So a key insight for you might be the importance of focus and individual responsibility in health and healing.
Heredity was a big one for him too, wasn't it? He could apparently see ancestral illnesses and considered that 40-45 age window a critical time for hereditary conditions to manifest.
Yes, like our lineage leaves these invisible imprints on our health. What's really impactful here is the notion that our health story isn't just our own, it's tied to the generations before us.
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. And his emphasis on diet is something we're hearing more and more about today. But for him to be saying it so strongly then, the kitchen should be a pharmacy and food should be medicine, is quite forward-thinking.
A classic saying, but he really lived it.
He did. This highlights the timeless wisdom in understanding the profound connection between what we consume and our well-being.
So, ditch the pharmacy, stock the spice rack. What kind of therapies and remedies did he typically suggest? I can't imagine it was a prescription for the latest pharmaceutical.
Not at all. His approach often centered on cleansing the digestive system and supporting liver function. And his go-to remedies were surprisingly simple, often things you'd find in your garden or pantry. Oak bark, onion, garlic, common herbs like parsley and horsetail.
My basic stuff.
Right. He even advocated a protein-free diet as a way to help the body eliminate damaged cells, including cancer cells, viewing it as a tool for prevention and regeneration.
Protein-free for cancer. That's definitely out there. Controversial, I'd imagine.
Hugely controversial, Nathan. But the source suggests potential benefits for fat reduction, blood purification, and even joint issues. It's a reminder that sometimes seemingly radical approaches can have unexpected positive effects.
But initially, he was quite strict about individualized therapy, not wanting patients to swap advice. Right?
Yes, very strict at first. But later, realizing the broader need, his wisdom was compiled into Páter Ferda's prescription book.
So he adapted.
He did. And it's fascinating how even those initially skeptical, the materialistic doctors relying solely on scientific evidence, had to take notice when his diagnoses consistently lined up with their findings.
The sheer volume of confirmed cases is hard to argue with.
Exactly. And apparently he had a pretty good sense of humor about it all, despite the skepticism. He was known for his kindness and his unique wit.
You need a sense of humor for this kind of work, I guess.
Probably. And he offered a lot of general advice that seemed rooted in his observations. So a key insight here might be that sometimes the simplest wisdom can be the most profound.
Hit us with some of those Ferda-isms. What kind of universal truths was he dropping?
Well, he advised using bananas and oranges sparingly, believing they could unnecessarily elevate white blood cell counts.
Really? Bananas and oranges?
Yeah, even suggesting an orange peel tincture as an alternative. He preferred cornstarch, maizena, over potato starch, solomil. He warned against the cyanide risk in plum pits and suggested boiled almonds as a potential antidote.
Cyanide and plum pits. Okay, that one's no.
Right, and he was quite adamant about avoiding canned foods due to the potential for harmful substances leaching into the food. It's a mix of folk wisdom and some rather specific insights.
Salt and vinegar produce wash makes sense. Avoiding fruit-only diet's probably a good call for kidney and colon health. Steering clear of sulfur in processed cheeses, interesting. And a thumbs down to colored candies. Hard to argue with that one.
Pretty straightforward stuff, mostly.
Okay, now let's dive into the deep end again. Kafka's fluidic body and this whole levitation thing. How does this connect back to Father Ferda's world?
Well, Nathan, Kafka's concept of this radiant energutron as a non-material body linked to the soul offers a potential, albeit highly speculative, framework for understanding extraordinary human abilities.
A speculative framework is putting it mildly.
Huh. Yes. And his explanation of levitation as the cytonic body projecting as invisible stilts is certainly a memorable, if completely bonkers, way to think about it. It suggests a level of control over our physical form that we rarely even consider.
It's invisible stilts. And that case study of the levitating subject resisting unethical treatment and then seemingly controlling gravity, it's mind-blowing, even if my scientific training screams pseudoscience.
I know, it challenges everything.
And 70-meter intentional jumps. It's the stuff of superhero comics. It really pushes the boundaries of what we think is physically possible.
Absolutely. Now let's pivot to something a little more grounded, but still fascinating. Father Ferda's strong views on molds. He called them the grave digger of life, believing these significantly hindered protein processing in the body.
Grave digger of life, that's pretty dramatic. He thought they were everywhere and tough to get rid of.
That was his perspective. He believed they were ubiquitous and resistant to typical cleaning methods. He theorized that when our immunity dips, say from a cold, these dormant molds could become active and cause all sorts of problems.
Okay, so opportunistic infections, basically.
Kinda, yeah. Interestingly, he saw red pigment as having mold-inhibiting properties and suggested moderate red wine consumption could be beneficial.
Red wine as mold defense. That's a new health trend I haven't seen on TikTok.
Right. Though he did acknowledge potential allergies. But he also warned about natural remedies being contaminated with molds if not properly sourced, and he was particularly suspicious of fish because of polluted waters. It seems he was very attuned to unseen contaminants.
So careful sourcing was key.
Very key. And the source does point out that his use of the term mold might have been a bit broad, possibly encompassing viral or bacterial issues as well.
Oh, okay. A catch-all term, maybe.
Possibly. He also had some specific ideas about the lifespan of fruit trees due to weakening and mold or parasite infestations. Plum and stone fruit around 15 years. Pear and apple around 20. Makes you think about how long we expect things to naturally thrive.
Definitely gives you a different perspective on that old apple tree in the backyard. What about his thoughts on colored clothing? That seemed a bit out of left field.
He believed certain colors could have negative health impacts. He suggested blue work overalls might contribute to thrombosis.
Blue overalls cause blood clots.
Wow. Yeah, and blankets dyed with substances like cinnabar and aniline could cause nerve inflammation. He pointed out that these older dyes might still be lingering in inherited items. So this highlights the idea that even seemingly innocuous things in our environment can have subtle effects on our health.
So it's not just what we put in our bodies, but what we put on them and around them. That's a good reminder. Then he specifically mentioned natural materials for pregnant women and undyed bras.
Yes, emphasizing wool, cotton, and linen for pregnant women's clothing, and carefully chosen undyed materials for bras to protect breast health and breastfeeding. This really underscores his holistic view, connecting even the most personal choices to overall well-being in future generations.
Makes sense. Now, cancer, a heavy topic. What was his perspective there?
He viewed cancer as requiring a specific internal environment to take hold, using rectal cancer as an example of conditions that could contribute. He saw a cancer cell as losing its way, forgetting its original function, and just multiplying without purpose, a tragic awakening of the oldest memory.
That's a very poetic and somewhat unsettling way to think about cellular rebellion. Like, the cell forgets its job.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from just the bad cells to the conditions that allow them to thrive.
What about the air we breathe and the spaces we inhabit? He had some thoughts on dampness.
Absolutely.
Huh.
He believed dampness in homes could actually absorb the positive, life-giving energy from nature, negating the benefits of fresh air. His quote, "Where there is dampness in the apartment, there is a breeding ground for diseases," is pretty direct.
So get rid of the damp.
He really stressed the importance of good ventilation. So maybe that slight musty smell in the spare room is more sinister than we think.
Makes you want to throw open all the windows right now. Okay, let's venture into even more esoteric territory, the soul. It seems understanding his concept of the soul is key to understanding his purported gifts.
Precisely, Nathan. He saw the soul as something that transcends mere intellect and consciousness. The source touches on how Western thought has increasingly marginalized the concept of the soul since the Enlightenment.
Pushed it aside, basically.
Yeah. It mentions J.E. Perkins' belief in a fundamental separation, a strict dualism between the soul and the material world as essential for true understanding. It's a perspective that contrasts sharply with some modern scientific viewpoints.
So, for Perkins, you couldn't understand the full picture without considering the soul. Interestingly, the source contrasts this with the Japanese scientific community, which apparently sought to bridge the gap between religion and science, seeing value in both realms.
Right, looking for synthesis, not separation. Makes you wonder if we've lost something by rigidly separating them.
That's a crucial point. The text critiques the modern trend of hyper-specialized scientists, sometimes lacking a broader historical and philosophical context.
Which could lead to a diminished sense of responsibility and a blurring of ethical lines. It cautions against elevating science and technology above fundamental human values. So a key insight here is the importance of a holistic understanding that integrates different ways of knowing.
It brings up the idea of reason as using what's available correctly, a definition attributed to Comenius. And it argues for trusting our common sense when it clashes with scientific pronouncements, warning against scientific manipulation that can erode our innate wisdom.
A call to think critically, basically.
Yeah.
Don't just blindly accept.
Right. This leads us to the subconscious mind, which is presented as a crucial element in understanding clairvoyance. The source mentions the psychological term expanded consciousness, and the classic iceberg analogy, the vast majority of our mental capacity lying beneath the surface.
Hidden depths.
Exactly. It highlights how individuals, like inventors, often tap into this deeper well of subconscious knowledge. And our friend Bertoslav Kafka is mentioned again as a guide to understanding this realm.
So the subconscious isn't just where we store forgotten memories. It's a potential source of extraordinary insight. And Kafka was mapping this inner territory.
Trying to, anyway.
Yes. And Comenius' 1937 definition of the soul is provided. The active principle of physical and spiritual life, encompassing thought, intellect, feeling, will, and imagination, a constant substance intrinsically linked to the body, present in every living cell.
So the soul isn't some detached entity. It's deeply interwoven with our physical being from the very beginning.
That's the view presented. The source emphasizes the philosophical mystery of this body-soul connection, acknowledging that while we can conceive of it, we can't visually picture it. It presents the view of the soul as simple, indestructible, and immortal, existing from shortly after conception.
Which carries significant implications for how we view and value life at all stages.
Absolutely.
It certainly does. Now, how do we even begin to wrap our heads around clairvoyance? It feels like such a leap from our everyday sensory experience.
The source acknowledges the inherent difficulty in explaining clairvoyance using conventional frameworks, drawing on Páter Ferda's own insights. It notes that he sometimes used clairvoyance and telepathy interchangeably, likely because his focus was primarily on living individuals.
So, reading minds, or seeing things unseen, blurred lines.
Seemingly. We're talking about a level of perception that goes beyond our five senses. And there are examples given, like these clairvoyant readings about the Helsinki Olympics and the Arnusberg case. Professor Tenhave's idea of subconscious associative searching is mentioned as a possible, more scientifically palatable explanation.
But that still feels a bit reductive when you consider the specificity of some of these readings, like finding a needle in a cosmic haystack.
It does. The source also points to the largely untapped potential of the human brain and its immense capacity for memory. It discusses the limitations and influencing factors of clairvoyance, suggesting it's rooted in the subconscious and shaped by our education, experiences, and emotional landscape.
So not everyone can just do it equally well.
Apparently not. However, Páter Ferda seemed to operate beyond many of these limitations, constantly needing to update his database with information about new diseases and environmental factors. His own accounts of his abilities are presented as particularly insightful.
So he was constantly learning, constantly refining his inner scanner. The source then touches on the difference between sensory, inductive knowing, and intellectual deductive knowing. Páter Ferda believed that the deductive method was essential for reaching absolute truth.
Going beyond simply observing the material world to understanding the underlying principles, it's a push to understand the why, not just the what.
Okay, makes sense.
And then we get into this wild concept of retransmission stations, based on Kafka's experiments where a hypnotized subject could draw energy from a living source, like a horse, to perform remote viewing without getting tired.
Like a psychic battery pack.
Kind of. And then it takes an even more bonkers turn with the suggestion of using satellites as retransmission stations for long-distance diagnoses.
Satellites as psychic boosters. That sounds like science fiction. Pure sci-fi.
I know, it's a huge leap of imagination, to say the least. But it suggests an interconnectedness and an ability to harness energy in ways we're only beginning to consider. The source also mentioned the apparent ability of the human body to transform energy, citing things like biokinesis and unexplained drops in temperature.
Stuff science struggles to explain.
Exactly. It all hints at this vast, unexplored potential within us, maybe even tied to the soul, that's often dismissed by scientific skepticism.
Okay. Now let's move on to this idea of an information field. It connects the biblical concept of everything being judged to this notion of a universal field holding all information.
Like the Akashic records, almost.
Sort of, yeah. Like the universe has a permanent record of everything that's ever happened. And our feelings about certain places might be tapping into that. Feeling good or uneasy in specific locations could be due to this field being imprinted with past events, even traumatic ones.
Like a psychic residue.
Exactly. It explains how faith can amplify the positive energy felt at pilgrimage sites. And C.A. Mace's psychic ether theory is mentioned as a potential mechanism for transmitting and storing thought waves. It's a way of conceptualizing how such an information field might operate.
So our thoughts and actions aren't just fleeting. They leave some kind of trace in this cosmic database.
That's the implication. The source then argues for broadening our understanding of ecology to include the spiritual realm, considering how we resonate with positive or negative information fields. It even touches on the potentially irreversible impact of our technological development on this field for future generations.
Wow, that's heavy. A call for a much more holistic and long-term view of our impact on the world. Not just physically, but
Informationally, Yeah.
spiritually. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now let's delve into the often taboo topic of experiences with dying, something Bretislav Kafka explored quite deeply. Right, the source highlights Kafka's earlier and more comprehensive work on the stages of dying, compared to the more popularized accounts of near-death experiences. He differentiated between the act of dying, clinical death, the period after clinical death, and true death.
It's getting very specific.
Yeah, and his core belief was that the soul animates the body, and death occurs when they separate. It's a clear statement about the nature of life and death.
He also had these intriguing concepts, bodily magnetism as a healing force within ourselves, and the fluid of the soul, or fluid odushi, which he saw as a radiant energy linking the body and soul with a finite lifespan.
Fluid of the soul. Okay.
He observed this fluid odushi receding during the dying process from the extremities towards the head based on accounts from hypnotized subjects, which eerily mirrored Socrates' descriptions of his own dying.
Whoa, Socrates.
Yeah. And experienced subjects could even seemingly predict the time of death by observing this fluid, sometimes contradicting medical opinions, as in the remarkable case of patient B in Horny Kostelec. It really makes you reconsider our typical medical understanding of when life truly ends.
That's pretty mind-blowing. Predicting death against the odds, it challenges the very foundations of medical certainty. The source also points out that the detachment of the soul seems to be a gradual process, with the dying sometimes expressing mundane concerns right up to the end.
Yeah, it's not like flipping a switch. And there's Kafka's account of a dying farmer experiencing this blissful state and hypnotized subject's strong desire to leave with him, requiring the hypnotist's intervention.
They wanted to go too.
Apparently.
Yeah.
It hints at a different reality awaiting us. Kafka also used suggestion in later experiments and explored the idea of a personal judgment after clinical death. It's fascinating how these findings seem to echo ancient spiritual texts like the Tibetan and Egyptian books of the dead.
It really does suggest a deeper, universal understanding of the dying process. The source then contrasts this with O. Lodge's spiritistic communication, describing a familiar afterlife, acknowledging the potential for the medium's subconscious to fill in the gaps.
Right, the imagination factor.
What about the strange phenomenon of fresh graves radiating energy?
Kafka's subjects interpreted this as a release of energy from the cells for months after death, influenced by the rate of decomposition in the soil. The source also offers alternative explanations for apparent visitations from the deceased, suggesting they might be subconscious warnings.
So maybe not ghosts, but our own minds.
Possibly. And it raises the thought-provoking idea that the dead might only be able to manifest physically to do good, contrasting with the loss of this ability for those who were unjust in life. It's a perspective that blends the spiritual and the ethical.
Interesting distinction. Okay, we've covered some truly out-there concepts. Now let's get into some of the more specific ailments and remedies that Father Ferda discussed. This is where things get really granular.
Indeed. He talked about medovka, these bouts of lethargy or attacks, potentially caused by overdoing it on honey or pears, leading to glycogen buildup in the liver and blood sugar imbalances.
Too much sugar, basically.
Seems like it. He also spoke of the fluidic energy in flowering fields and consciously connecting with them for an energy boost. Interestingly, he warned pregnant women against pears, believing they could weaken muscles and lead to prolonged labor.
No pears for pregnant women. Specific.
Very specific. And he could apparently detect anabolic steroids in athletes, which is quite remarkable, without modern testing. He had ethical concerns about it, but also a humane doping method using caramel to precisely regulate liver sugar before races, a very unconventional approach to athletic enhancement.
Caramel doping, that's certainly a new one. He saw recipes as potential blueprints for new technologies, which is an interesting way to look at traditional practices.
Yeah, like finding the active principle.
And he considered onion and garlic poultices immediately irreplaceable due to their volatile compounds. His general approach to therapy was to pull out the bad stuff, not just pour in remedies, often using teas and poultices together for a synergistic effect.
The old detoxification idea.
Right. He even noted that an initial worsening of symptoms could be a sign of healing, like a Herxheimer reaction, maybe?
Exactly. He suggested St. John's wort tea for overdosing on other herbal teas, a kind of natural antidote. Etovka, a rye-based coffee substitute, was recommended for blood cleansing. He advocated daily raw parsley and carrots.
Eat your greens and reds.
Pretty much. He had specific instructions on the correct concentration of Sunar infant formula and suggested chamomile and meadowsweet tea as an alternative calcium source. Cornstarch was preferred for children's pudding over potato starch, and he recommended sweetening with caramel only, warning against artificial colorings.
No artificial junk for kids. Good advice.
Definitely. Oatmeal was beneficial for children's teeth. He cautioned against cold drinks on an empty stomach and had a honey and horseradish concoction as a remedy. For the negative effects of green potatoes on the cerebellum, he suggested a cottage cheese and garlic poultice.
Green potatoes affect the cerebellum. Wow.
According to him. He even had a tip for reducing nitrogen content in potatoes by adding oak bark to the boiling water, emphasizing the quality of young oak bark for tea. Alder branch broth baths or compresses were recommended for varicose veins, along with sour cabbage poultices. He also mentioned Dr. Urbanic's vascular gymnastics for circulation.
He was generally against penicillin, a very strong stance for the time. If it was necessary, he'd recommend cottage cheese and onion poultices on the liver and young oak bark tea afterwards.
Mitigating the side effects, maybe?
Seems like it. For diabetes and sclerosis, he suggested juniper berry and heather tea and chewing dandelion stems in spring. Valerian drops for nerves, horsetail, and nettle baths for reducing water retention. He was strongly against excessive salt intake, linking it to heart issues.
Ahead of his time on the salt thing.
Definitely. He even pointed to a decrease in heart attacks in Japan after refrigeration reduced the need for heavy salting of fish. For prostate problems, an onion and anise poultice. He touched on the, cures-like principle with pigeon eggs for athletes, with a warning about improper use.
Don't just copy blindly.
Right. He warned against scientifically enriched animal feed and championed traditionally unconventional foods like seaweed. Long-term storage of canned foods was a no-no. He respected salt used wisely and preferred natural sources of trace elements. Modern cured meats using rapid curing salts were also on his blacklist.
Back to basics, natural cycles.
Seems to be the theme. He stressed the importance of when and how food is prepared and eaten, avoiding cold items on an empty stomach, and highlighting the role of salivation and mindful eating.
Digestion starts before you swallow.
Exactly. He had other quirky advice. Chestnuts under the bed for harmful radiation.
Chestnuts, okay.
Sweet flag in ponds for fish mold. Willow branches for trout health. He noted how animals self-medicate and suggested applying similar natural remedies to domestic animals. He cautioned about cyanide buildup in preserved stone fruits. Proper herb harvesting and drying were crucial.
A lot of detailed folk wisdom.
Loads. The source even shares an anecdote of him accurately diagnosing 4 patients in an hour in Russia, impressing skeptical surgeons. He framed clairvoyance not as mysticism, but as an understudied aspect of our inner lives.
Trying to normalize it in a way.
Yeah. There are even humorous stories about him being introduced to widows and a physics PhD inadvertently confirming his abilities. He defended his work against a critical newspaper article and sent accurate diagnoses to the USA. He occasionally criticized those unwilling to help themselves and lived by the simple philosophy of following nature's laws and using common sense.
Sounds straightforward enough.
Yes. Ferda's recipe books offered general preventative advice. He discussed returning to natural medicine with a doctor, highlighting ancestral wisdom. An experiment with marked metal rings tested his remote diagnostic abilities. There are more humorous anecdotes about prisoners and Father Ferda's interactions with crowds, pretending to be a helper.
Gotta admire the wit.
He maintained good humor despite challenges, except when his healing work was interfered with. Even a well-known herbalist sought his diagnoses, and he had a darkly humorous warning to a young woman. She'd live a long time and make a beautiful corpse.
Huh. Morbid but funny.
All this leads us to the concept of charisma, extraordinary gifts used to help others, driven by goodness and service. Father Ferda, Jan Mikolasik, and Kvita Patatuva are given as examples. He even reflected on the weight of such gifts.
The burden of the gift.
Exactly. The source addresses how some misunderstand religious teachings to argue against healing, pointing out the absurdity of this view in the context of medical practice. It notes how experienced doctors often work with intuition. The Catholic Church's view of clairvoyance as an innate ability that becomes a charisma when used for good is clarified.
So not inherently evil, just an ability.
Right. True charismatic healers are distinguished from those using manipulation or mass suggestion. Finally, the source delves into conscience, education, and freedom, discussing the decline of moral certainty and B. Kafka's experiments revealing a universal ethical code through hypnosis.
A built-in moral compass.
That's the idea. This code, it argues, is vital for education, emphasizing clear distinctions between right and wrong from a young age. True freedom is presented as aligning with this innate conscience, not just doing whatever you want.
Deep stuff to end on.
Well, you've taken a truly deep and winding journey with us today, navigating everything from practical health tips rooted in folk wisdom to some seriously wild and bonkers ideas about the human potential and the nature of reality surrounding Father František Ferda and the intriguing theories of Bretislav Kafka. It certainly gives you a lot to chew on, doesn't it?
It does. A real mix of the grounded and the mind-blowing. And perhaps it leaves you, our listener, pondering this. Could there be more to our intuitive abilities and the interconnectedness of our health, our environment, and even the echoes of our past than modern science currently acknowledges?
Food for thought indeed. Teolumen Insights.
Teolumen Insights.
And if you enjoyed this plunge into the extraordinary, please remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the fascinating and the unknown.